So thank you for coming to this latest iteration of the latest talk in our series on the Forgotten Man in the era of Trump. Today we are joined by Paula
Ioanide.
Yeah, I should have gotten that.
No,
I meant to ask you earlier.
Don't even worry about it.
Ioanide. And she's going to be presenting on Whiteness in Decline, the Emotional Politics of White Nationalist Resurgence. Paula Ioanide is an associate professor of comparative race and ethnicity studies at the Center for the Study of Culture, Race, and Ethnicity at Ithaca College in New York. Her teaching and research examines the social and spiritual wounds caused by mass incarceration and militarized policing, anti-immigrant discrimination, and increased poverty resulting from neoliberal policy shifts. So her work fits squarely in the sort of discussions we've been having about the Forgotten Man. Her book, The Emotional Politics of Racism, How Feelings Trump Facts in an Era of Colorblindness, was published by Stanford University Press. She organizes against prison and jail expansion in upstate New York, conducts workshops on increasing racial and gender equity in higher education and employment settings, and she believes in creating social justice cultures and movements that foster healing, interdependence, dignity, and freedom. So hopefully this will be one more step in that direction. So thank you for joining us, and please welcome Paula Ioanide.
It's always so weird to get introduced. You're like, oh, what did I write on that thing? So thank you so much for having me. And I was thinking on my way over here. So today's actually, I'm just gonna introduce myself a little bit by way of today's date. Which is that it has now been 30 years since I moved to the United States, because today was the date we came 30 years ago. I'm originally from Bucharest, Romania, and I was born and raised there until I was the age of 10. And we left as political refugees under what was at the time a communist regime. And there's a longer story there as to why we left. My grandfather had some contact with the United States, and by affiliation with him, we then just kind of got blacklisted and became sort of enemies of the state. It was a dictatorship at the time. And so it's a really bizarre day for me to be presenting on this, in part because I didn't become aware of my racial identity until I moved to the United States. And even then, obviously, you know, if you're from a country like Romania, you think of yourself as Romanian. You don't necessarily think of yourself in racial terms, in part because, places like Romania are highly homogeneous racially, although they do have some ethnic minorities and racial minorities, specifically the Roma people. But overwhelmingly, it's not like that's how you kind of grow up thinking of yourself. And it took me another, maybe, I don't know, well into my 20s to really understand why things were the way they were in the United States with respect to the social relations here, and with respect to, even as a young kid here and as an immigrant and as a foreigner who didn't really speak English when I first came, having parents who have heavy accents and not understanding capitalism at all because we didn't understand consumer culture because we didn't really have that in Romania. It took well until my mid 20s to really get somebody to tell me the real American history of this country, right? I mean, pretty much my entire educational curriculum from the time I arrived in fifth grade to really after I graduated undergrad, I did not really get a real sense of what caused the racial and ethnic inequalities in the United States. I knew that they existed. I knew that I shouldn't cross certain neighborhood lines, right? I knew that I shouldn't affiliate with these folks, and I crossed those boundaries as much as I could in an effort to try to figure out why everybody was segregated, why people were discouraged from sort of having deep friendships with one another, and so on and so forth. So it's ironic that I should be presenting on this today, but because I have a much better grasp of why things are the way they are, I sort of, committed myself to academia in part because because that shift in knowledge really shifted my entire worldview. It really changed my life and the way I act in it. And without that knowledge, I don't think I would be where I am today. And so it's in part out of recognition for my former mentors and my own teachers, right, who taught me, but also because your guys' generation, not that we're not, in the same national climate, but this younger generation, right, in some ways is unique in that it is impossible to ignore the signs, right, of sort of racial antagonisms, of the rise of very deeply racist aggression against immigrants, against Muslims, against black folks, against different, the rise of misogyny, I shouldn't say the rise because it's all already been there, right, but it's sort of like intensified, accelerated, become more overtly expressed, and in other ways I would say that the opposition to those old forms of being, right, whether it's whiteness and patriarchy and heteropatriarchy, right, like all of those things are also coming into deep question and into deep crisis, right? So that's kind of what I'm going to talk to you guys about today. Now, having said that, I really like interaction. I can't stand like just talking to myself. So if at any point you just want to pause, interrupt, ask a question, please do so. I'm going to talk for a little bit to just kind of lay some groundwork, but then I hope we have like a really interesting discussion and ask questions that you otherwise have been maybe holding for yourselves. Clearly you already have a deep background in some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about, which is a big relief because then we can kind of advance to the next level of discussion so we don't have to kind of cover the basics as I was telling you guys, yeah? All right, so and the last thing I want to say is that I think Sean, who by the way, thank you for inviting me here, shared with you guys that College Fix article, right, that generated, the last I looked, something like 500 comments. And I think that even just something as small as that article, which is, nobody spoke to them, they just really wrote an article based on a title and an abstract. But the fact that it triggers 500 comments amongst a certain population of the United States, many of them extremely, violent in their language and derogatory and, et cetera, should tell us that this is a really sore point for a lot of folks, right? And I try to come at that with, I have a lot of opinions about it, right? But I also am trying to understand why they think the way they do, right? And understand sort of the kind of get inside that worldview for a second to just try to understand how its logics work, which is kind of what I want to talk to you about today, right? Okay, so I just kind of want to lay out the key questions that I'm going to talk about, which is whiteness really in decline? I know I said that in the title, but I actually really want to pose it as a question. And if so, how, right? The second is how is the current crisis in white American identity connected to white nationalist resurgence? And what is the significance of the emotional economies of white rage, anger, resentment, and anxiety in shaping the 2016 election and its aftermath? And then finally, are there any possibilities for reconstructing white identity from its dominant form, right? The dominant things that we normally associate with white identity. And here you see kind of can anybody see this? Is the light, oh yeah, you can see it, okay.
Turn off one of the...
Is it possible to maybe just turn
the
this
one
right
right here,
ones?
actually.
Okay, that's awesome.
Oh,
That's perfect. Can you still write and see? Okay, great. So this is, as you might remember from the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, which takes place on a college campus, right, at University of Virginia in August of 2017. And here you see sort of, white nationalist protesters fighting with counter-protesters over the Confederate flag. And in some ways, for me, this picture really symbolizes the rising contestation over white identity and its meaning, right? Especially as several of the counter-protesters here are black, but in the actual rally, many of the counter-protesters were white. And so there was a kind of contestation between white people over the meaning of white identity and where it was going to go from here, right? And the victim who dies, Heather Hayes, right, is also a white woman. So it becomes this kind of crucial moment of both indicative of, you know, the fact that this is actually happening in 2017, that we're having, you know, the equivalent of a KKK rally, right, in 2017, but also that there is a significant counter resistance to it in a way that maybe in previous eras we wouldn't have imagined, right, in quite the same way. Okay, so do you guys know this term called whiteness as property? Have you heard this term? What does it mean to you, or where? You nodded your head, so I'm picking on you.
Oh, no, don't ask me.
Don't ask you? Okay, anybody want to kind of take a stab at it? It's a concept that is developed by Cheryl Harris, right? Who's a critical law studies professor, right, and scholar, who kind of gets us to think about this connection between white identity and property entitlements, right? And not just the entitlement to accumulate stuff, right, like to own stuff, but literally the way that both law and social customs sort of give white folks in the United States a sense of deep entitlement and the expectation to have certain rights that are exclusive to them, right? So I want to talk today a little bit about this, use this concept from Cheryl Harris of whiteness as property, but really think of property in kind of two senses, okay? And the first one is to think about property in terms of like what David Roediger calls the economic wages of whiteness, right? Or the wages of whiteness, as we kind of normally talk about it, is these economic benefits that whatever your persuasion might be ideologically, as a white person in the United States, right, you get automatically. You don't have to actually intend to get these benefits. You just get them by virtue of, you know, being perceived as white, right? So obviously sort of white passing people of color can also get some of these benefits, and we know that there's a whole spectrum of like, you know, colorism, right, that sort of preferences lighter skinned people of color over darker skinned people of color, which is kind of how it gets set up as this point of reference, right? But historically, the economic wages of whiteness is the racially exclusive access to land ownership, opportunities for wealth accumulation, better jobs, education for most of American history, right? So this stays true. For example, just one little stat, right? So the 1862 Homestead Act, 1862, right? Homestead Act, 46 million white Americans can trace their wealth today to that Homestead Act in 1862, which essentially gave acres of land for people who are willing to develop agriculture westward, right? And literally gave away free land, but exclusively did not give this right to black folks, right? So when you exclusively give it to white people, over time, if you gave them that benefit of free land, and of course it was never free because it was expropriated from indigenous peoples, but that accumulation of wealth over generations means that today 46 million white Americans can trace their wealth back to that, right? So that's just one policy. But obviously you can also think of, I understand you've studied the New Deal, right? So if you think about the Federal Housing Administration loans, these FHA loans, right, that the New Deal sort of gave to working class Americans, right? Trying to allow working class people to be able to have to get mortgage loans so that they could buy a home in a way that they couldn't have before, right? Between 1934 and 1962, 98% of FHA loans went to whites. Well, what does that mean over that 30-year period? It means that if I only or so overwhelmingly give access to mortgage loans subsidized by the government, and this is the key part, is that people of color obviously are paying into the tax system, that money the government redistributes only to whites, right? So it's literally, when we say something happens at the expense of people of color, what we're saying is literally the blood, sweat, and tears of people of color to pay taxes into the resources that the government sort of redistributes, and then to have those resources redistributed only to white people who apply for FHA mortgage loans, then enables that, right, that generation of whites to essentially gain wealth over time through the accumulation of wealth through homeownership, right? So that's what we mean by the economic wages of whiteness, is that there's this intricate relationship to government policy as well as private market practices that almost exclusively give certain economic benefits to whites at the expense of people of color, right? Or at the exclusion of people of color. So in the New Deal, you also, I'm sure, studied the Wagner Act, right, which allows for this kind of unionization, the right to unionize, etc. But of course, this right is not given to domestic workers and farm workers, the majority of which are, of course, people of color. So when you give unionization, we think of it as this amazingly progressive thing. It allows higher wages and great job security. But because that disproportionately, the industries that it was allocated towards were white, primarily white men, right? And you excluded purposely domestic workers and farm workers who are overwhelmingly Black and Mexican and Filipino people at the time, and Asian people, right? Then you have literally taking subsidies and then given them, rechanneled them towards white advantage. Does this make sense to you? Okay. So that's one way we tend to think about it. The other way we can think about the economic wages of whiteness is the cash value derived from the absence of racial discrimination. Can anybody think of an example of this? What would be an example of how do I get money from not being discriminated against? It's a weird way to think about it, but it actually, you could probably calculate it even in your own lives if you think about it.
Higher wages?
Higher wages. So how does that work?
White people tend to have an average higher wage than people of color.
Yeah, by virtue of just applying, even with the same qualifications, same jobs, right? And then there's a difference between white men and white women, right? Where white men make more than white women. But literally, if you just, for the same job, same qualifications, if you compare the wages of white people versus people of color, there's a disparity, right? What else? Another way you can think about this. Think about police stops, right? Think about driving while black. If you calculate, I want some sociologists to do a calculation, right? Of how much money black and brown people spend on dealing with police tickets that are actually a result of racial profiling, right? So if you think about court fees, the fact that you got a traffic violation, right? The fact that maybe you were arrested, maybe your car was impounded, maybe you had to go and bail somebody out for something that was absolutely minor, like driving with a suspended license, right? All of that over a lifetime calculates into a cash value. Does that make sense? So simply the fact that white folks get to not be discriminated against, whether in the labor market or by the police in terms of the number of traffic stops and violations, right, gives them actually a cash value, right? Okay, so did everybody get that? Everybody with me? And if you're not, please raise your hand and we can discuss it some more. Okay, so the part that I don't think we talk about as often in Whiteness is Property, and Cheryl Harris doesn't explore this in depth in her article, but implies it, right? Is the public and psychological wages of whiteness, which is actually a term that W.E.B. Du Bois uses in 1930 when he's writing this epic book called Black Reconstruction in America, in which he does an incredible analysis of Reconstruction and its aftermath, right? And and Du Bois doesn't really explain it either, but he sort of notes it in this like minor passage and then kind of moves on. But essentially, I've spent quite a bit of time trying to theorize this idea of the public and psychological wages of whiteness, which are related to the economic wages of whiteness, but they are really kind of social and cultural entitlements and expectations that have been safeguarded by law, practice, or custom exclusively for white identity, right? So Cheryl Harris, for example, in Whiteness is Property, talks about this legal right to exclude, right? That is given exclusively to whites. So when you think about like, you know, the water fountain that says whites only and, you know, colored people water fountains, you think about the spatial arrangement of redlining in urban cities, right, that literally lasts until the 1960s. This is about the exclusive right to exclude. This is about telling people where they should live and which spaces they can occupy and which spaces they can't occupy, right? So while I, as a white person, can move about super freely, right? I'm mobile, I can go in and out of different neighborhoods, I can sort of move around without fear of policing and all of these kinds of things. This gives me a kind of an entitlement to mobility, an entitlement to space, an entitlement. But it also historically gives me the entitlement to dictate where others should be. Does this make sense? So for me to say, you know, you can't come into this space and you can't use this library and you can't use this public pool and you can't attend this university, gets embodied right, as a psychological and emotional form of entitlement. Does this make sense? Where you walk around feeling like you are a manager of people, like you own the space, right? So I joke around all the time when like you go to like a club, right? And like one time I went to this club and it was like a reggae show, you know what I mean? And I live in Ithaca, New York, which is like this sort of, you know, like known for its kind of like hippie culture, whatever, white hippie culture type of stuff. And which is not all bad, but you know, in this case, we're at the club and I'm there with a bunch of women of color, right? Me and a bunch of my women of color friends. And we're trying to dance, right? But this white woman sort of comes, right? And she has sort of dreadlocks and, you know, is your typical kind of like, you know, hippie type, yeah, I'm stereotyping her, I know, but she really was like that. So she's like dancing in the space, right? And she's like literally hitting people, right? Because she's just getting her dance on and she's doing this like really big movements around and around, right? And the next thing, and I go up to her and I say, excuse me, and I'm like super nice, right? Like I'm not even antagonistic, nothing. But I ask her, can you be more conscious of the space you're taking up, right? Because other people can't dance because you're literally about to flail at people. She got so mad at me, right? Like I can't tell you how visceral her response was that I was infringing on her sense of entitlement to the space. You see what I'm saying? Now I'm not saying she calculated that in the terms I'm using, right? I'm saying literally it's an almost unconscious embodied psychological sense of I belong here and I am not the one who needs to like sort of be careful about hitting people, right? Which is not something that, historically is a historically genealogy, it has a genealogy of that accumulation, if that makes any sense, right? So in that sense, this kind of mobility of presuming that you can be mobile without harassment and the ability to denigrate and violate people of color with impunity is this kind of expectation that nothing will come to punish me for having this right to exclude, to violate, to etc., right? So when we talk about police brutality today or police killings and how there's never consequences for that when black and brown people are getting killed, right? And some of that has to do with the law, but when you look at sort of lynchings in the 1920s, well into the 1950s, right? There's this kind of white mob entitlement to do as they will without any expectation that there will be some kind of serious consequence and infringement upon that entitlement. Are you with me? So the key thing I want you to kind of walk away with here is that the public and psychological wages of whiteness yield very specific emotional and psychological rewards. And it's the reward of feeling superior, of knowing that you won't be punished, of knowing that I can designate myself above these people. It's not just that people tell you that in conscious thought. It's the idea that you, in the way you move around the world, you expect that to be true. Does that make sense? So you're not just, it's not just something that like, because if you ask most, like when I ask most my own white students today, like, do you feel racially superior? Almost all of them say no, at a conscious level, right? But if you watch certain actions, right, these patterns of behavior around entitlement, around space, around who owns stuff, who has the right to designate and dictate, then that is where you see these kinds of emotional and psychological entitlements, right? And when they are infringed upon in any way, when somebody tries to limit, curtail, challenge, critique those entitlements, is when you see this extremely, big reaction to it, okay? All right, so I'm gonna go relatively quickly through this, but I wanna kind of just talk about the racial contract of the United States. Is anybody familiar with Charles Mills's book, The Racial Contract? Phenomenal book to read for you to kind of get a philosophical view of why the United States has never had just a social contract, right? Between sort of like, if you study philosophy, it's like the social contract is, the government in relation to its citizens, right? But that it's always been a racial contract, right? So, and again, I put 1650s because that is when there's a shift in the transatlantic slave trade in the way that it starts associating slavery with blackness and with, right, because there was obviously a time when white people were also indentured servants and, weren't in some kind of, didn't have this deep sense of entitlement either, right? So there's a long process through which that happens, but until about the 1940s, right, there is this kind of racial contract that, and this is the key part I want you to remember here, is that poor and working class white Americans gradually align with rich white elites to gain these public and psychological wages of whiteness, right? So that for most of American history, you have a super rich white elite, the land-owning class, right, the slave-owning class. And then you have everybody else. There's really no middle class to speak of. There's a little bit of an artisan and kind of, you know, professional clerical class, right? But relative to today, it's a really small number of people. And then the vast majority of people are like really, really poor whites, right? They're not doing some extravagant, they're not rich people because they're white, if that makes sense, right? And the question for labor historians is always, why do they align with rich white elites who economically exploit the heck out of them, right? Their status they stand to lose in this alignment with rich white elites because the elites sort of always try to exploit them. And Du Bois's argument is that the psychological and public wages of whiteness end up trumping economic interests. And I know this sounds crazy, but basically, if you looked at the conditions of the poor white working class and the black working class, they would have stand to gain a lot from aligning against this rich white elite class. You know what I mean? Because they outnumbered the rich white elite and they had very shared interests class-wise, right? But that never happens in American history. And the reason it never happens, it happens like in certain moments of American history where interracial alliances happen, but overwhelmingly this real significant cross-racial labor movement never really takes place, right? With the exception of like maybe the 30s and 40s when all of these kind of interethnic alliances do happen to some degree, but not in like a serious way, right? And what Du Bois's conclusion is that just to feel the feeling of superiority and knowing that you're a little bit above this bottom, right, gives you enough of a boost that you would rather elect that than go through the difficult work of creating a kind of class solidarity against the rich white elite, right? And the elite sort of knows that and constantly incentivizes poor whites to align more with whiteness than with their economic interests, if that makes sense, right? Okay, now obviously there's major breaches to this contract over the time, slave revolts, indigenous resistance, black soldiers forcing the Union and Lincoln to declare emancipation, the amendments, Reconstruction. It's not like a seamless thing. History's messy and chaotic, right? But generally it gets to be maintained in that way. From the 30s to the 80s, you have a kind of different racial contract whereas before you had a white working class that largely didn't have these economic advancement, class mobility opportunities, right? They relatively stayed poor, and then the rich white elite sort of benefited. From the 30s on, and this is where the New Deal becomes super important, right? And racially discriminatory practices in mortgage lending become absolutely critical to giving this white working class, who are largely Southern and Eastern Europeans who are recently arrived, right, and are not yet quite white, but you incentivize them to assimilate into whiteness and into the racial logic of the United States. Why? Because you essentially give them economic advantages that are exclusive to them instead of, right, because there were some interracial solidarity movements there, but as soon as the New Deal sort of preferences whites in housing and mortgage lending, in jobs, and in Social Security, what you see is that whites once again elect to identify with whiteness instead of this international solidarity cross-racial labor movement. Does this make sense? So what ends up happening from the 30s to the 80s is that you have the creation for the first time of this white middle class who largely becomes the middle class through the accumulation of wealth through homeownership. So we're not talking about like the rich white elite type of level of wealth. We're talking about people who in the 1930s and 40s buy a house, continue to stay in working class type of jobs, but by the second generation, the increase in the wealth from that buying of that house gets passed on to the next generation. The next generation then is allowed to go to college, is allowed to do all of it, has a head start, right? And then as we know about wealth, it doesn't stay stable over time, it compounds over time. The more wealth you've got, the more it compounds over time, right? So this contract then creates a kind of social entitlement and expectation that white Americans should enjoy both economic upward mobility as well as the psychological wages of whiteness. So the way that this racial contract sort of differs from the previous one is that the previous one really traded primarily in the psychological wages of whiteness, right? Whereas this one actually now fuses the two, because now there's a presumption that, hey, if I'm white, by the next generation I should do better, I should have access to the American dream, and my next generation should also do better, right? Now, the freedom movements of the post-World War II era, right, from black folks, from Chicano folks, from American Indian folks, from feminist movement folks who then challenged patriarchy in the way that it's sort of always already embedded in this racial contract, right? Basically are saying, you know what, here's this opportunity structure. We not only are going to abolish overtly discriminatory laws that keep us excluded and unable to access any of these jobs, housing, mortgage loans, housing, education, and so on, and transportation, right? So it's a major win when you think about how that era of overt exclusion, legal exclusion, kept people of color from even being able to participate in the opportunity structure. Do you see what I'm saying? So abolishing those laws becomes really significant for literally just, and it's a very modest gain. It's simply the gain to compete, right? Like, it's sort of like saying, okay, people of color, now go ahead, you try to, right? Whereas before, they couldn't even compete. You would go to the bank, apply for a mortgage loan, no matter what you did and how you qualified you were just denied because you were black, right? Whereas now that opportunity structure is forced to be opened, and as a result, then there's actually an incremental shift in people of color's educational attainment, their increase in kind of class status, right, class mobility, and so you would see kind of these modest gains, right? But it's not nearly as radical of a transformation as many of these movements would have wanted it to be. Because the most radical of the freedom movements sort of staged by people of color was overwhelmingly trying to actually redistribute the resources that white folks had exclusively gotten over time, right? And that never happens. It's literally sort of like, okay, we'll allow you to compete, but here's where white people are in the head start, here's where people of color are in the head start, right? So it's like, not only do you have to make up this ground, right, in that kind of race to inclusion, but you are still gonna face massive discrimination along the way. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, everybody with me so far? Okay, so it's important to kind of have this context, because in the 1980s, the landscape changes once again. And the reason it changes is because basically deindustrialization begins to happen, and the shift towards deregulation and neoliberalism also begins to happen. And as a result of those shifts, essentially whiteness, which had kind of consolidated into a kind of racial contract of we get these economic benefits as well as psychological benefits, begins fracturing once again, right? And so now we're back in the post-1980s, I would argue we're closer to a structure for whiteness, it's more akin to like early 1900s than it is to like most of the 20th century, right? And so what ends up happening is that major class fractures begin to happen within whiteness. And I'm gonna go through this in more detail, but basically rich white elites experience an unprecedented growth in their wealth, like unseen in the history of the world. Okay, and I'll show you a chart to really hone that home. The white working class, however, people without a college degree, actually do begin to see significant declines in job prospects, right? The manufacturing sector sort of closes. Small rural communities in particular experience a massive decline in farming and agriculture and because of globalization and multinational corporations sort of going for cheap labor across the globe, right? And then the white middle class begins to experience a little bit of the effects of neoliberal economic policies in the 2000s, with shrinking incomes, fewer job prospects, massive increases in debt, right? And again, I'll go through that. But the key point here is that in the post-World War II commitment to white working class upward mobility is pretty much abandoned by the people in power. In other words, there is some truth to the white working class saying we have been forgotten, right? If you look at sort of like the economic palace, so there's this kind of dashed expectations, right? And then also significant is that there's a massive shift in racial demographics in the national population, coupled with kind of shifts in the symbolic and cultural landscape. So this is kind of the contract I want us to go through in much greater detail. Okay, so the question is whiteness really in decline? And the answer is yes and no. Okay, so for white working class people, particularly in the rural location, yes, but only relative to their post-World War II expectations, okay, and absolutely significantly less than people of color without a college degree, okay? So the question is whiteness in decline? Yes, but compared to what, right? And so here you see in this massive, they actually like, in The Economist, where this chart is from, they actually have a forgotten man index, so I thought it was funny that they should actually name it that. And the graph is kind of difficult to read if you don't know what you're looking at, but that orange line is white working class men who are defined essentially as white men without a high school, with a high school degree or less, okay? And if you look at the unemployment rate, you see that they do have a higher unemployment rate when you compare them to all men, which is the blue line, that the percentage of the working age population is less overall in labor force participation, and that their hourly wages is less relative to all men. Now, it's kind of a bad chart, right? Because all men, who is all men? You know, I mean, you have such a wide range. If you compare, for example, black young men and then, you know, middle class men, they're all aggregated in that all men. So it's kind of, it's a little bit misleading. But nonetheless, compared to that, they are experiencing some kind of decline. And maybe the more telling one is here, because this is 1994, and here you can see the disparities, right? So that basically what this is showing is that you know, relative to even 1994, unemployment has increased, the labor force participation has essentially declined, and wages have also declined, right? So there is some truth to, especially the white working classes, downsizing. Now, this is really the kind of unbelievable chart, and it takes a minute for you to kind of maybe look at it and really see what you can tell from it. But that first chart is 1963, and what it's telling you at the bottom is this is where I need a pointer, right? This is the people whose wealth is in the 10th percentile. This means the poorest class of people over here, and this is the richest class of people, right? And then the question is, how much of the total wealth do they have, right? Essentially, and so in 1963, you see that poor people were at minus $19 million in wealth in the lowest 10%. The 50th percent had about 41,000 dollars in income, right? And the richest 1%, which is the 99th percentile, was somewhere at 1.5 million. If you jump over to the present, look at what happens to the top 1%. I mean, this is the greatest disparity we've ever had between the rich and the poor, right? So the top 1% is now, you know, basically their average family wealth is $11 million, whereas the bottom 10% is minus $950. Right? So the poor have gotten poorer and the rich have gotten astronomically richer. Now, this is not broken down by race and ethnicity. This is for the entire country. But here, you essentially can tell that the white working class, who tends to be in this sector, is experiencing a decline. And they're specifically experiencing a decline compared to the 80s, which is when this deindustrialization and deregulation and globalization neoliberal era kind of begins. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Now, the other really important thing is that there's rising rates of white mortality and morbidity in rural areas, right? And so there's this huge to-do in various publications about this, because essentially for the first time in a very long time, basically white people are experiencing a huge rise in death rates, and specifically in rural locations, right? So the top chart here is white women between the ages of 35 and 39 living in a rural area, and they're experiencing a 48% rise in the death rate. When you compare that to black women in the same age group in an urban area, you see that black women's death rate has actually significantly declined, right? So some people were like, well, why are white women and white men dying at a much higher rate all of a sudden, right? And this rate sort of begins, you see how the rise in the rate begins in the 1990s, right? So they're trying to answer this question, and the morbidity part is also interesting, and what they're kind of finding out is morbidity means like you're also sick, right? On top of dying at a higher rate, you're also sick at a much higher rate. So drug abuse, drug addiction, alcoholism, opioid epidemic, diseases of the liver in particular, obesity, all of these things, smoking, right, are all kind of causing this incredibly higher rates of morbidity rates, especially for white women in rural locations, right? And so these are supposedly the kind of class of people that in the Trump election, right, he was sort of talking about, the forgotten people who are dying and experiencing this hardship. So there is some truth to that, but again, we got to really qualify that, because here's the overall death rates per 100,000 people, and you see that African Americans still have the highest death rate. Latinos are less than, right? So the news here is not so much that somehow this gap has totally closed, right? The news is simply that the death rates is increasing for whites. Does that make sense to you? So it's sort of like, if you're only looking at these charts, you're like, whoa. But then if you go back into this chart, you still have to ask, but compared to who? And compared to what? And when you do that comparison, you still, of course, see that people of color, especially African Americans, are still experiencing much higher death rates, right? So again, it's because whiteness is not used to comparing itself to everybody that essentially it sort of freaks out anytime there's a kind of loss, right? There's also sort of rise in middle class debt, and job creation by multinational corporations, as you can see, sort of really declines, right? Beginning with the late 1980s. And this is all as a result of kind of Reaganomics, right? And that kind of neoliberal shift. Median family wealth, though, when you look at it, and again, this is by race and ethnicity, if you're looking at wealth relative to black folks over here and relative to Latino folks over here, you still see that there's a huge, huge advantage for white folks in terms of family wealth, right? Now, what is significant, though, is that there's a major dip there, right? Right around the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, okay? And that decline is the largest theft of wealth for black and Latino folks due to the extra discriminatory lending practices of the subprime mortgage crisis, which I understand you guys studied, right? It means that, I mean, literally it's been calculated as the largest theft of black and Latino wealth in the history of the world, in the sense that there was predatory lending that targeted those communities of color and therefore took from them the little gains they had made only from the 1960s, because only in the 1960s could they even compete to get homes, right? That's when redlining practices are abolished and the Fair Housing Act passes, right, in '68. So the little gains that they had made, you see, dip enormously in 2008. But for whites, that dip there is enough to trigger this enormous fear, right? And again, the fear here, and I can't emphasize this enough, is that when you are used to having an entitlement to constant wealth accumulation over time, and you have the expectation that that should continue for the next generation, any little dip in white wealth is basically a crisis. Even though relative to folks of color, you're still way, way, way advantaged. Does this make sense? Okay, so that part is like kind of, again, compared to what? And then I kind of want to just pause for a second and say that, you know, this is kind of the economic analysis, but the other major fear here that produces a kind of crisis in white identity that we're kind of living with today is a shift in racial demographics and in culture, right? So it's like the economic dimension is one part, but the racial demographics and the anticipation that essentially the United States will get less and less white. This is a projection of where we will be sort of by 2065. This is where we're at in like 2015, right? And so this right here is the decline of kind of white numerical majority. And if you hear nativist groups, I'm talking about the anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, very targeted white nationalist groups, right? They really are truly afraid of losing numerical majority numbers. And they're truly afraid of what the significance of these racial demographic shifts will be, which is why they target immigration policy to stop the immigration of predominantly Asian and Latino folks, because essentially, as you can see, black folks are staying relatively the same amount of number, but Latino and Asian and other folks, immigrants of color, are essentially the largest growing people, right, minorities. And so that also has an effect then on the changing religious landscape of the United States, where Christianity is also in decline because there's a rise in non-Christian faiths, which is to be expected when you have large numbers of immigration from South Asia, right, or East Asia and other parts of the world that specifically Muslim, right, the Middle East and certain African countries that essentially are dominated by our Muslim countries, right? So that's part of the thing. But then the other major shift is essentially the cultural and political shifts, right? And here, again, we're kind of talking much more about the psychological wages and the emotional wages of whiteness as opposed to just the economic ones. And, you know, when I talk to folks of color, you know, the little representation that they have in the dominant mainstream media is like laughable, right? I mean, you're still talking about enormous disparities in who produces, controls, directs, and creates media, whether it's film, music, news outlets, and so on and so forth, right? Nonetheless, beginning in the 80s and the 90s, you do have a massive shift, particularly where hip hop culture actually becomes mainstreamed, right? In all of the kind of problematic ways in which we know it does. But nonetheless, if you're looking from a white nationalist perspective, or a perspective of white Americans who are literally experiencing the kind of fear of decline, of loss of their culture and the dominance of Western culture and this type of rhetoric, right? The fact that television sort of starts increasingly featuring forms of popular culture that originate from people of color is understood to them as a threat, right? Is understood as this is a signal of the decline of kind of Western culture, right? And what's going to happen, and my kids are going to get exposed and so on. And when you have like the very mainstreaming, obviously Shonda Rhimes, and like I always talk to my students about like, how did she do it as a black woman to put 3 shows on primetime television? Like, it's kind of incredible if you know the media landscape prior to that, right? Featuring black women in protagonist roles. And again, we can critique all of these things, but the news here is that for somebody who was so accustomed to the incredibly whitewashed media, mainstream media, all the way into like the 1980s, right? And then all of a sudden over the last 20 years experiences this massive shift in what's represented in culture, for them it looks extremely threatening, right? And then finally, I can't emphasize the significance of President Obama's election, because for people who are sort of identified with white nationalism and a kind of fear of white cultural decline, what it means for a black president, and I should really say a black family, moving into the White House, right? So this irony of like a house that was built by slaves now actually, right, the highest seat of power being occupied by a black family and by a black president. We all know the significance of the election, right, in terms of like, I mean, I don't know how, you guys were probably too young in 2008 to remember this, but there was all kind of touting of we're now post-racial and, you know, racism is over. And what you see in response to that, because in some ways this is the ultimate symbol of decline, right? Now, if you actually look at President Obama's and his administration's policy shifts, they're not really that significant in terms of helping people of color, especially impoverished people of color. He had the largest number of deportations, right, than any other president prior to him. So if you're looking from like a Latino perspective, right, who helped to elect him, as a president, he kind of failed you, right, on an immigration policy question. Or if you're looking at him in terms of like, well, what did Obama do for creating affordable housing and jobs for people who are formerly incarcerated? Or did he really stop mass incarceration? I mean, if you're looking from that perspective of the most disadvantaged communities of color, he stayed pretty centrist and pretty mainstream, you know, and we can kind of come up with a bunch of reasons for why that happened that way they did, right? But he, symbolically speaking, was absolutely a threat to the white imagination and the way that it had presumed for hundreds of years the entitlement to rule and to govern, right? I mean, if you look at like turn of the century, like Birth of a Nation, anybody seen Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith, right? I mean, if you look at what that film sort of represents in terms of the Ku Klux Klan coming to save the day from black people taking over government in terms of Reconstruction, this is the equivalent of that for most of the people. It's like that so-called nightmare coming, it's like D.W. Griffith's nightmare coming true, right? So then the question is, white nationalists are essentially looking at this, and it's not really just white nationalists, like people who explicitly identify with white nationalism. It's white folks who are afraid that any aspect of their entitlements, whether economic, social, legal, are going to be infringed upon. So although the shift is largely symbolic, right, it nonetheless creates this incredible fear. And so just to kind of represent this, this is the number of anti-government groups that emerged during Obama's administration, right, compared to previous eras. You see how low they are in the George W. Bush era, in part because during this era, there is a coherence between, right, this idea of white entitlement and the government's role is to safeguard my interests. Even though at a policy level, he doesn't depart that much from many of the things that George W. Bush did. I mean, okay, we could get into the details of that, but what I'm saying, it's not like a radical shift, right? This is the level of anti-government groups, so-called patriot groups, right? And this is from the Southern Poverty Law Center, who literally they're like, you know, they keep track of all the different kinds of groups. And so then you can see the incredible rise in that, and then of course they sort of start declining once Donald Trump is elected. But my point here is that the crisis ushered by the real and sort of projected economic losses and the decline of the US population and these kinds of ruptures in white dominance in cultural domains demands a mechanism for the release of collective white anxieties, resentments, anger, and aggression. So it's as if you have all these people who are disgruntled, right? Who are now looking like, how do I channel all my rage? How do I express how I feel? To whom do I express it? And I can't express it, I specifically express it against my government because my government now supposedly doesn't represent me. And when that happens, you have essentially the takeover of mob mentality, of white mob mentality. When white folks sort of don't feel like the law and the government is representing or safeguarding those white entitlements, whether economic, cultural, or demographic, they take it into their own hands. You see what I'm saying? So part of what we need to understand is that Donald Trump's presidential campaign, as well as his current administration, sort of understood this crisis in white identity very well. And nobody believed, right, he sort of relied on this tried and historically effective tactic of race baiting and racial scapegoating And he disparaged virtually every group, right? I mean, he's Mexicans, Muslims, I mean, nobody was left out. And in, of course, a hugely misogynist way. But he very effectively traded in the psychological wages of whiteness, allowing white Americans to once again permissively enjoy exclusive entitlements and endorsements that white Americans were so fearful of losing. And this is the key word, is permissively. Because it's not as if this fringe ever went away, ever, right? It's always been there. But when you have an alignment of government endorsing this rhetoric and at a policy level supporting it, you have an emboldening of it. Does that make sense? So Trump's move into the presidency signaled the state's renewed commitment to preserving and advancing white domination, as is being demonstrated left and right through the current administration policies and practices, whether it's the Muslim ban, the building of the wall with Mexico, right, or the kind of law and order restoration in black communities. Those white Americans who no longer felt that their government represented their interests now feel that they have regained political representation and power, right? And the irony here is that, of course, white Americans never really lost that power. I mean, relative speaking, right? But in the epistemology and ontology of whiteness, the mere projected prospect of such a loss is sufficient to instigate an offense. So we're talking about something very powerful at the imaginary and kind of psychological level here, right, in a kind of mass psychology. Now, most liberal constituents who disidentified with Trump's overtly racist, xenophobic, and misogynistic rhetoric greatly underestimated the political value of the psychological wages of whiteness, right? That is, they underestimated just how easy it is to exhume overt bigotry as a mechanism for regaining psychological and emotional rewards and enjoyments when a platform for this collective expression is nationally endorsed. What I'm trying to say there is that nobody believed Trump would win, in part because we don't know our history very well, right? And if you study these kinds of ebbs and flows of white nationalist resurgence and white racist terror and mob mentality, you know that it always comes right after a period of racial progress, right? And so as I argue in my book, The Emotional Politics of Whiteness, white Americans have chosen to retain their enjoyments and emotional benefits derived from racial domination, even if this sometimes means acting against their own economic interests. And what I mean by that is that Trump is never going to serve the economic interests of the white working class. But it doesn't matter because he gives them those emotional rewards and those psychological wages. Does that make sense? So, or you know, people imagine he's going to bring back jobs and all this stuff in a period of globalization. It's absolutely impossible to restore, you know, kind of like industrial level era of the white working class. And anybody who kind of pays attention knows that. And if you look at just who he is as a rich elite guy, you know he's not going to do some kind of economic policy that truly benefits the poor, right? But nonetheless, most of the poor, as well as most of the white middle class, actually significantly identifies with him. So here's what happened. Oh, sorry, I forgot about this. This was essentially what I just said. But I want to show you this. Oops. Okay, so here's kind of a breakdown of how people voted. And you see how overwhelmingly white people voted for Trump and how people of color overwhelmingly voted for Clinton in that top chart, right? But here's the one that really people kind of look at, which is that non-college whites, this is the white working class, so overwhelmingly identified with Trump, and college-educated whites also identified with Trump. So here is a kind of convergence between the white middle class, middle to upper class, and the white working class. And you can't explain that, right, except to say there's a convergence of interest between for the psychological wages of whiteness, right? Because the white middle class, the college-educated white middle class, also stands to suffer from a Trump economic policies. You see what I'm saying? Like, he's not gonna like do away with school loan debt and do away with, you know what I mean, like build some more funding for public higher education or build better public schools. No, he's looking to privatize everything, right? Which is also going to hurt the middle class, but nonetheless they identify with Trump, right? And here, the even more crazy part, is that we expect white men, because of the misogyny and the kind of patriarchal authority that Trump exudes, is a restoration of that loss of white patriarchal power, heteropatriarchal power, right? But even white women are not persuaded enough about his misogyny to go against their racial interests, meaning the psychological wages of whiteness. I can't explain that otherwise. There were so many reasons as a white woman to disidentify with Trump on the basis of misogyny. He gave you every freaking, he was gonna tell you he's gonna grab your pussy, and that wasn't enough, right? So I can't explain it except to say that there's this deep racial identification, right? Or there's a kind of internalized patriarchy where white women too, right, identify essentially with that kind of heteropatriarchal authority. Okay, and then, so finally, this is the white supremacist groups in the United States today, and that didn't come out very clear. These are all the ways that they break themselves up. The white nationalist movement is not coherent by any stretch of the imagination. They have their own sort of massively internal fractures and disagreements as to how to go about staging this, what they perceive as a retaking, right, of the nation. And so you have your classic KKK groups, your neo-Nazi, your white nationalist, your skinhead, Christian identity, which are explicitly racist and xenophobic, neo-Confederate, anti-Muslim, and anti-immigrant groups. This is just in 2017 alone, right? But I guess what I'm trying to get at is that we have severely underestimated the emotional economies of racist aggression and enjoyment, and their unique value in moments when white American identity is in crisis. So I have always asked myself, how can people who have so much feel so perpetually insecure and fearful, such that they would rather endorse a nationalist resurgence of racist and misogynist terror than reconstruct white identity to stage its sense of value and worth on the principles of social interdependence, mutual benefit, and ecological sustenance. And what I'm trying to say there is that it's amazing to me the perpetual way in which white nationalist groups stage themselves as the most victimized groups in America today, right? That they have a narrative of victimization even though they have the most that any group has in America, if that makes sense, right? Even if you're poor and white, you still have relatively more, than if you're poor and of color by all sociological indexes, right? But this is where I say that the emotional and psychological dimensions have been under-theorized. We don't really get how significant those wages are for how people understand themselves and how they narrate their own place in the world, right? Yes, you have a question.
I was just wondering, is this graph and what you're referring to like specific identified groups, or are these people who just in general believe?
These are groups, these are not individuals.
So I was confused about
So there's 72 KKK groups across the United States.
Yeah, I was confused about how anti-immigrant could be so low, but if that's about specific groups, then I get it. They overlap often.
Right.
It's not like the KKK is going to be pro-immigrant
Right.
either. Yeah.
Also, a general question kind of going off of that. So, be classified as a group, is there a certain number of
Yes, so this is the Southern Poverty
membership,
Law
I guess?
Center. Yeah, this is the
Okay.
Southern Poverty Law Center who kind of keeps tabs of this.
Uh-huh.
And there's some phenomenal details on their website if you're interested in going there. But you have to have named yourself a group. Usually you have to have espoused a specific kind of manifesto of who you are. And then you have to indicate that, you have a certain number of people who belong to that group. So it's not like one person declaring it on a website.
Exactly.
You have to be a kind of
Yeah.
known collective. Yeah.
Exactly. Perfect.
Okay, so my point is that, white identity could go in a different direction. And in some ways, right, so what I'm trying to say is that currently we're in a moment where white identity is trying to reconstruct itself under its very old terms. It's sort of like holding on to the same old of how it understood itself, right? Which is in association with exclusive entitlements to economic, cultural, and social dominance. I actually believe that white identity could reconstruct itself to mean something else and to identify and its sense of worth and value on other terms. For example, interdependence. Be ecologically sound, by which I mean instead of privileging individualist self-aggrandizement and short-term profits, you could actually think about environmental sustenance and what that would take at a consumer level, and so, movements like Standing Rock give us these really clear examples of how otherwise white identity could be constructed. In relation to being allies to indigenous-led movements at Standing Rock, right? Those people who participated in those alliances are willing to revoke that old contract of, we're just going to keep exploiting the earth for our short-term benefit at the expense of indigenous people in violation of treaties, as well as in environmentally polluting our land, right? Or you have something like the Poor People's Campaign currently led by Reverend Barber and many sort of cross-racial alliances there that are really trying to think about the white working poor as as facing true economic challenges alongside Black and Latino working poor and immigrant working poor, right? And trying to think truly about an interracial alliance that actually then gives us all some kind of mutual sustenance, right? But that's a very different kind of understanding of white identity, and even in the movements, right, in the counter protests to the Unite the Right rally, you see that a lot of white people were finally willing to sort of stand on the lines and say, I'm not going along with this version anymore. I don't want to keep going with this racial contract. I actually want to not be silent and complicit and so on and so forth. So, and this would have to be another talk, because we really need to theorize what stands against interracial alliances, and a lot of it is the distrust that people of color have for white folks who want to be in alliance, right? Because you can always opt out, you can always walk away when it gets tough, or are you truly willing to lose some stuff, meaning like the material wealth and so on and so forth, and are you willing to lose some of your relationships, right? Because as it certainly has been the case in my own family, when I learned the true American history and some of the stuff I've just shared with you today, and I went about and talked about it with my family, I can tell you that there were fights, like serious fights, and serious moments where I could not talk to my brother, for like a year, because I just was like, what? You're too racist for me to sort of keep exposing good people that I love in my life to you, But at the same time, you still have to stay at it. You still have to stay at the work of, this is an ongoing process. It's not like you're just kind of like one and done, right? So anyway, I'm sort of going to wrap up there about the possibilities for reconstructing white identity under other terms. There aren't a lot of incentives for us to do this on an economic basis, right? But there's enormous benefits. Benefits is the wrong word. There's incredible dignity and how do I say, sort of connection, true, genuine connection that takes place, right, when you actually kind of start resituating white identity in alliance with oppressed peoples, right? Meaning an alliance, meaning like, how do we actually get this stuff to happen, right? Not some like I did a like on Facebook. I'm talking about real stakes, putting your body on the line, putting your wealth on the line, putting social relationships on the line, real stakes that actually then develop the possibility for this interdependency, right? Okay, so I'm going to stop there and see what kind of discussion you guys want to have.
I feel like this might be a good segue. I was wondering if you can expand on like the epistemologies of ethical witnessing.
Oh yeah, right. So that was my attempt in the book to provide a counter.
I think I like know what you're doing. Like,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't cut you off.
No, that's great. Tell me what specifically you're thinking about it.
So essentially, what I'm trying to see is you have this like sort of like movement and like cognitive thought within like an ideological subject, and in this case like white people, right?
Right.
And then like so it's not like a how to interact with ideology, but it is like what is like the power ideology has over the subject, right? Like the Althusserian concept, right? Like
yeah.
So there's like, so you're kind of saying, I think, that you can like recognize this thing as a sort of theoretical frame but then how to actually like live inside of that
Yeah.
brings into question like the event. So when you're saying like a post on Facebook or anything, or like put your body on the line, that it cannot happen over the course of like a given time frame, like an event or like a movement, but rather that it plays out sort of in like a, I guess like a like the ideology sort of like washes away and is replaced with something.
Precisely, yeah. So let me give you a really concrete event or a thing that you guys are really familiar with that happens all the time, right? So I know probably most of you are on social media to some degree, right? And whenever a police killing happens of a person of color, right, people share that video over and over and over again, right? And the question is, why are we sharing, right? On the one hand, we're sharing because we want other people to know that we're witnessing this thing, right? And that depending on how we're framing what we say along that police video, right, we're saying this is unjust, right? Other people share the same video and say this person deserved it. So where I started thinking about ethical witnessing was in this kind of spectacular nature of watching racist terror, right? There is no guarantee, so people assume oftentimes that somehow the evidence will just speak for itself, right? This cop shoots this black man in the back while he's running. Isn't it obvious that there was an injustice there? And what we have learned over and over again is that nothing speaks for itself, right? That framing is everything. So depending on what interpretive frame, the way you're looking at that video really determines what you're actually seeing, right? So if I'm part of the TCOT, have you guys seen TCOT? Like, it's like the Twitter feed for conservative, right? So they'll share that same video and be like, he must have been doing something to run away. He must have deserved it. What kind of man runs from the police? All kinds of narratives that then legitimate it as if it's justifiable, right? Whereas like on my social media feed, it's gonna be like, F the police, here they are again doing this kind of thing, right? So what I was trying to think about with ethical witnessing is that witnessing in itself does not guarantee in any kind of way some kind of automatic connection to justice, right? I could be watching that and enjoying it, right? If I'm identified with a lynch mob, or if I'm super identified with the police, and I actually witness that, I'm like, aha, I'm enjoying that, right? Whereas if I'm super identified with anti-racist justice movements, right, then I'm gonna watch that video and be horrified. So the ethical part of the witnessing comes in this spectacular nature of racist terror. And the way that it just doesn't guarantee for any of us that we're gonna, one, how are we gonna witness it? Are we gonna feel some kind of indignation? Are we gonna feel remorse? Are we gonna feel an identification with what happened? But even more important, are we gonna do something about it?
Yeah.
Right? And this doing something about it is the real question of ethics for me. Because for me, if you're just like, oh my God, I feel so bad, another police killing. I call that feeling bad for feeling good. Sorry, feeling good for feeling bad. So you're just like, oh, I feel so bad. I did my work. I call that, you do a performative affective labor, then you call that, you know, like, oh, I feel so bad. Then you feel good that you felt bad, and now you're done with it, right?
Starbucks.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the entire media infrastructure encourages us to do this feeling good for feeling bad constantly and to not move out of our seats, right? Whereas the ethical part comes on, am I actually going to do anything beyond that feeling bad? And that means that's exactly where you start experiencing the stakes. And so the stakes are, as soon as you actually align yourself against white supremacy as a white person, it becomes very clear, right, that you'll never feel the kind of violence that people of color generally feel. But as soon as you make that alignment, you start getting little bits of it, right? So I was going to share with you guys this email that I got, right, from that college fix. Now imagine, right, all I did with this college fix, all they had was a title and an abstract about whiteness and decline. 3 sentences, right? And, oops, hold on. 3 sentences, and this is one of the emails I got, right? So you get this kind of hate mail, because you guys, I don't know if you saw, but there were like 500 comments. So just speaking against white supremacy, right, as a white person, this is the email. The title is, "Why don't you go live in Nigeria, you anti-white Marxist?" That's the title of the email. He says, "Anti-American scum like you are so pathetic. When blacks and browns take over, you idiotic white guilt feminists will beg white men to save you. Enjoying upstate New York and its lack of diversity, you hypocrite." I'm not like, this is an email. It's not going to do anything to me. You see what I'm saying? But I'm talking about simply posting a title in an abstract signals to some people, right? The entire logic of what we've just been talking about is in these 3 lines. I, as a white woman, have betrayed the white patriarchal contract, right? By aligning myself with brown and black people. I'm going to learn my lesson, and later, white men are going to have to come and save me. I'm also affiliated with Marxism, right? Because supposedly if I do a political economic analysis, I'm sort of communist, right? And I should go live in Nigeria. It's just like wild. 3 sentences, and you have the entire, I'm reading it to you because I want to show folks, right, how live this stuff is. And so I've done nothing except submit an abstract and a title to Sean, right? Now, but if I actually start really organizing against mass incarceration, against police brutality, I actually show up at the protest, right? Then you might lose your life, or you might get into a fight, or the stakes really become clear, right? So that's why ethical witnessing to me was a way to theorize a concept to not simply sort of give us an easy way out, us being white people, us a way out of just like I'm gonna just feel bad. Oh yes, I espouse that, but then I give nothing. There's no stakes. There's no sacrifice on my part for what I'm willing to relinquish in terms of the stakes. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that's the ethical to me. The witnessing is one thing, but then the ethical, to make it ethical for me, it has to be some kind of real life stake.
Okay.
Yeah. Other questions, things that came up for you? Yes.
I just have like a really, really general question, kind of going back to like the anti-government groups that it was just basically with the 4 presidents listed. It's, my biggest question was actually with George Bush's. It's just because it was so low. Would you probably bring that to because of 9/11 and whatnot?
Absolutely.
That's why it was at an all-time low.
Absolutely, and that patriotism, that the resurgence of kind of a nativist patriotism against a kind of foreign enemy that was the kind of, Muslim terrorist other. Now, you'll be surprised to read some speeches that George W. Bush gave that actually tried to sort of soften the kind of association that people were having between Islam and terrorism. So he was like, Islam is a peaceful religion, there are many good Muslims, blah, 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 right? But of course, it's like, you say that in a couple of speeches, but your policy in terms of the Patriot Act, the tortures, Abu Ghraib, and all of these things show exactly what you feel, right? And so this is where the anti-Muslim groups really start forming. But again, it's sort of like, it's the new arch enemy. If during the Cold War, the arch enemy were communists, post 9/11, the arch enemy are terrorists, right? And specifically kind of affiliated with the Middle East. And that creates a binding emotional economy. So if you read the book, my book, The Emotional Politics of Racism, I have a whole chapter on how that happens around Abu Ghraib, but specifically the war on terror. Other questions? Yeah.
So then would you say with Obama, what the spiked up is about the difference between a recession, an Occupy movement, other things like that, where it's not necessarily about his race. It might be partly about that, but it's also about people losing money, people losing their freedom to think that government is on their side. Another Vietnam in a sense, where they've seen everything, they see it day by day on the clock, on the television, on what's his name? Not Matt Lauer, but the evening news guy. To see every day about people on the streets protesting, but then the other one would be then saying, why aren't you working if you have whiteness, or if you have this possibility to work. But then you're just saying you're denying work.
Mm-hmm.
There is a struggle that's happening there where it's not a race, it's not about politics of money, it's not about this, but it's about what you actually hone in on your own body, getting you a job. Maybe you don't have access to a suit, you don't have access to grocery stores in that moment in time. But we're seeing in this Obama era, specifically at the start, he had to come in and wrangle up what he knew about that type of economic policy, where I think his stronger suits were more about the urban planning more than the economic growth of a country. So
well, he actually took us out of an incredible recession, right? So people always forget that because he inherited from Mr. Bush over there the worst recession, one of the worst, right, since the Depression. Like it was incredible, right? So he had to figure out an economic way out of that, and it's hard to figure out an economic way out of that when your when the U.S. Treasury is so deeply in bed with multinational corporations, right? So there's no way that Obama could just go radical all of a sudden, because literally if you let AIG fall, or if they didn't get any of the government bailouts, right, which is why we kind of have this term corporate welfare now, there's no way they could have. Right, they knew, the U.S. Treasury knew that the whole economy would have tanked, but why would they have tanked? Is because we had allowed multinational corporations to gain so much monopoly and power over our economy, so little diversification that there was no alternative to that. Do you see what I'm saying? And so Obama took us out of that recession, but when you're starting from the very bottom and kind of make these small incremental changes, nobody thinks that's progress, right? They only think it's progress once you're kind of like really far up there. So Occupy was in some ways a symptom of people being fed up with, that was actually an example of a channeling of anger and rage and aggression that was directed at the right enemy in the sense that it was those multinational corporations who had stripped middle and working class America of their, had given them stagnant wages, greater economic insecurity, part-time jobs instead of full-time jobs. All of that movement of wealth upward to the top 1% really did contribute to the economic losses of both, the working up. Now, if you look at that breakdown by race, people of color suffered under the recession at much, much deeper disproportionate rates than white folks did. But again, because white folks weren't used to experiencing that loss, for them and their identities, which are very deeply enmeshed with property and having stuff, with possessing wealth, then the hit was literally to their sense of self. You see what I'm saying? But so again, it's not like a linear movement, because we see examples like Occupy, or even a resurgence of teachers unions currently on strike in Wisconsin, and there was Wisconsin before that, of kind of a massive strike for middle to working class people of all colors, right? So it's not as if it's sort of like that's the only thing happening, but that's why I say you could have taken that rage and resentment and an experience of loss and channeled it in some other way. But because the left is absolutely terrible of understanding emotional politics, they just keep giving us those are not the facts. Those are not the facts. Trump could tell 17 lies, and all they'll do is be like, that's not right, that's not right. But in the popular imagination, it's already taken on as if this is the truth. So it's in my view, you need a counter narrative. You need to provide another vision for what people could identify with, other than white nationalist resurgence. You know what I'm saying? But we haven't really provided that alternative vision. In localized movements, I would say that alternative vision, emerges. And one could argue that Obama did provide that counter narrative of kind of if you're an immigrant, you could be of different religions, but we're all stronger together, right? And he kind of gave people a way in, but then he didn't translate that into necessarily actual economic policies or massive, and his hands were tied because he had a crazy Congress. But my view is that he didn't do much with that alternative political vision in terms of the emotional politics of it. Does that? I don't know if that fully answers your question, but we could think more together on that, because it's not like, yeah, I mean, I'm taking a slice, you know, and a focus, but it's not everything. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's just like, it's so hard because like you have a perfect answer at the end for what white people are supposed to be doing. You already know.
That's right. Yeah.
And have already been convinced of giving their life and making stakes for themselves, but I think this like an amazing question that you pose of like, how do you like give incentives to people who literally like have this
who stand to lose from that divestment, right?
Yeah, and like there is nothing that you could say to people.
Yeah.
And unless like Obama was saying, it's like, don't you want everyone to be equal? Don't you want love to go on? Don't you want all of these beautiful things to happen to the world? And it's like, no, because then I won't have any fucking money.
Yeah, exactly, right.
And there are so many people, like the people in this room, who do not give a shit about money, but like there's just like no answer, and continuously in this class there's no answer for that, and like it's so frustrating. But like, I don't know, like it just blows why I can't talk right now. It's because it blows my mind that like we have another speaker now coming in who poses the exact same question, and like that question is the biggest question I think. Like, well,
and I have actually a concrete answer to the money question, in the sense that, well, first of all, let me backtrack. When I ask my students what percentage of black folks do you think participated in the civil rights movement, what would you guys say? Like, of all black people, what during the kind of height of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, what percentage do you think actually actively participated?
40%.
30%? 50? 15? Yeah, it's like closer to 10%. Now, the reason I tell you that is because it's absolutely amazing what a small number of people can actually do, relative speaking to the overall population, right? It doesn't actually take convincing the entire population, you know? It takes a leadership, it takes the leadership of a small number to strike the imagination and convince a different social warrant, right? And so, for example, the money question and the answer I have is, if you go back to that graph we looked at the richest 1%, I mean, this is astronomical. Even if you took like 5% of that wealth, everybody would do okay. And read it, you know what I'm saying? Like one of the things that is incredible to me is that we're in this culture of believing that we're scarce, that we have scarcity, that there's not enough money to go around. Actually, there is. You know what I'm saying? And we're so used to having so little, even like, you know, you guys are like, I'm sure, walking away with huge amounts of student debt. And relative to working poor people, you actually have way more, right? But that 1% has like billions and billions and billions on our backs. Meaning, like, if you just tax them a tiny bit, we would all have a huge amount more. You know what I'm saying? And so part of it is like, look at the gaps. I mean, 1963 versus today, it's outrageous. This is in 2016 dollars. That's outrageous to go from 1.5 to 11 million or 10.5 million. You know what I'm saying? So that's one thing. And if there was enough political will and convergence around reshaping economic policy to redistribute it more towards the bottom, you could actually not get into like, you know, like, oh, I have to give up all I have type of dynamics. The second thing I would say is that we have shifted our money. So if you look at the federal budget and where our taxpayer dollars are getting allocated, 50% is going towards militarism. I mean, Eisenhower was saying in the 1930s that 13% was already a military-industrial complex. We're at 50%, and Trump just increased it by 14%. Okay, so when you're thinking about all the wars that the United States is keeping up globally, even if we stopped a tiny percentage of that, we would have more money to redistribute for things like affordable housing, education, infrastructure, transportation, and the things that everyday people need, right? The other thing is the mass incarceration craziness, right? I mean, we're now in an era where policing and correctional unions and mass incarceration takes up so much of our budget that you're talking about housing, the average cost of housing one person per year is around $40,000. What? At 2.2 million people incarcerated, you do the math, right? So, and then 7 million under supervision. So that so disproportionately falls on communities of color and ruptures generations of communities of color. Even if you scaled back to 1990s level of mass incarceration, you'd have way more budget to know what to do with in terms of redistributing it towards things that actually give us life. You see what I'm saying? So for me, it's in part about like this individual question of like, what's my responsibility? But it's also about keeping my fucking government accountable. Like, where do I actually want my blood, sweat, and tears to go? Do I want it to go to militarism, mass incarceration, policing, correctional unions, and all of these things that basically destroy life and depend on perpetuating systemic racism? Hell no. So even if you've got like, I don't know, 10% of white people to start being like, hey government, we want you to do something else. And just trigger the imagination for other people who are suffering under huge amounts of credit card and school loan debt, suffering to buy homes, suffering because they don't have that access to the American dream, and got them to identify so that the government actually goes and shifts some resources. You know, now it's going to be very hard because, again, this white nationalist resurgence very deeply identifies with that agenda around mass incarceration and militarism. So that's what's at stake, right, in these next elections and over the long term. So it's that, and even if we just stopped discriminating, not actually gave mortgage loans to people of color, but just stopped discriminating, meaning like subprime mortgage loans, instead of being targeting communities of color, if we had actually just prohibited doing that, you would have had greater equity. So it's not just even being that I mean, like, to me, that's just like not that hard. You could have an enforcement mechanism, you know, that's a state run and operated, you know, that essentially held mortgage companies accountable to not discriminate against people of color. And then they would be able to sort of naturally accumulate wealth better, and therefore have more political power, and therefore have greater access to education and all those other things, right? So I'm like not short on ideas on the money question, you know, but where it's hard is, for white folks in particular, I think, is because that suffering has not necessarily been yours personally. For a lot of middle class folks, although for working class folks it has been, economically speaking, right? It's the question of how to convince yourself to get over the fear, right, that I'm about to lose everything if I actually go and align myself towards these things. And the only answer I have for that is that, and this is now coming from me as somebody who has done organizing on the ground, you build so much connection with other human beings on such a deep level. It's so your life becomes so meaningful, and you trade in the alienation and the me and the I only want for myself for this much greater meaningful community of people that have your back and whose back you have. I wouldn't trade that for the world at this point. But I didn't learn that theoretically. I learned it on the ground. You know what I'm saying? You have to actually experience it to get a taste of how beautiful it can be to have those deep interpersonal alliances and trust. And then your life sort of takes on a very different meaning than, you know what, I'm gonna die if I don't have a job, and if I don't have a job, my mom's gonna kill me, and da, 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 you know, I mean, like that kind of logic, right? And I'm not saying that stuff isn't real, because it is, you know what I mean? Everybody gotta figure out how to make bread at some point. But I'm just saying it doesn't become as stark if you're not dealing with it individually, because you have a community of people that have got your back, and you find ways to mutually support one another, you know what I mean? And to share resources. So it's not as hard as people think once you actually kind of try to do it. Yeah.
So I'm interested in this question of the relationship between what is racial, what is economic, and what's ideological.
Yeah.
Three different levels, because it looks like what you're arguing is largely animating this white nationalism, and the decline in its whiteness are kind of racialization processes historically. But the noises throughout the talk is that there are economic forces. There are larger, deeper kind of organic economic forces. So I'm interested in how are you theorizing those levels of determinations and over-determinations between what one might call are driving political economic forces in relation to racialization processes, in relation to this ideology, or this emergence kind of dominant ideology of white nationalism.
Yeah.
And maybe to give a more concrete example, and if you look at that chart that you shared, the chart with Clinton.
With Obama and
So your reading of it, right, is clearly that race has something to do with it, right?
Right.
The alternative reading is, 2008, 2009, there you go. That's the housing bubble. That's where people are losing houses, losing jobs. So what's the exact kind of relationship between the economic, the racial, and kind of this ideology?
So I actually have now, I can't think about economics outside of race. For me, they are so entwined in American history, and it took me a long time to know that, because like a good student, I learned economics as if it was autonomous separate from. So if you conceptualize race and racism as a kind of ideological formation, and you don't understand its historical genealogy as always already being enmeshed in economic policy, it's really easy to sort of falsely separate the two. But if you trace, especially from the New Deal forward, so the 1930s, the incentivized and racialized ways in which economic policy works, such that there is never a labor market that isn't racialized, that doesn't benefit white men over and above people of color, right? There is never a housing market that you could say this is just about economics, because the housing market is always already determined by explicitly racist policies that try to redline people of color, to deny them loans so that they can't access wealth. So when you look at racial wealth gaps, you have to trace it to that racialized way in which economic policy explicitly gives economic advantages in housing and wealth accumulation through housing to white people, and denies it to people of color, right? If you look at educational attainment as an indicator of income, for example, right, which is often the case of what people look at for wealth inequality, there is never a time in educational settings in the United States where education doesn't correspond to residential segregation, and therefore, because education is funded through property taxes, and property taxes are correlated, higher property taxes are correlated with exclusively white neighborhoods, you can't unmesh the funding of public schools and then the funding of who has access to higher education from racial politics, right? So my argument would be, you can't really dissociate economics from race in the United States context, because at every single iteration it's been.
You can't collapse them to one another either, right? So I guess what I was trying to ask is what the exact kind of relationship in terms
right.
of...
So this is where I was getting at. The white identity part is that it has become so accustomed to meshing the two, meaning you're so accustomed to getting exclusive economic benefits, expecting economic benefits, that when you lose them in any way, even if the forces that are causing them are not at all having to do with race, they're having to do with multinational corporations and neoliberal shifts, right? Or automation or deindustrialization. Even though that's the case, you go towards racial scapegoating to attribute the real cause of your economic ills to the fact that
people of color are stealing your job, immigrants are taking taxpayer resources. So although it is a false belief, it is the most common belief. Does that make sense? So it's because, in my mind, it's because white identity is so deeply historically connected to accumulating stuff, accumulating material wealth, that and it has such a historical pattern of blaming people of color for the reason why there might be an infringement on any of that material wealth. Hence the anti-affirmative action. I mean, if you look at affirmative action and what it has done economically for people of color, it's so small. And yet, this is a huge thing in the white imagination as to why I'm suffering economically. Do you see what I'm saying? So there's a misnaming of the true causes of your economic decline and a scapegoating of people of color for it. And no matter how much you say, you know what, you have the wrong causes, and you give people all the evidence, they don't believe it. Like, they're so committed to the fact that it must be these racial other people that, you know, that is the cause. And so if it wasn't for that go-to scapegoating, then you would have something like Occupy, right? Where you actually channel your resentment, and that does happen. So it's not like all white people only. There's obviously the other half that didn't vote for Trump and doesn't identify with white nationalism, you know what I'm saying? But what I'm saying is that more often than not, about half the country, right, that identifies with the conservative agenda goes to this go-to racial scapegoating. The other half that's a little bit more in the know and is actually studying the actual economic causes of, you know, this economic decline understands better that, you know, it's much more complex than that. But it certainly doesn't work well as political rhetoric. So Trump knew this, and so what did he do? He sort of scapegoated every group of color you could possibly imagine, blamed globalization to some degree, NAFTA and so on, but overwhelmingly the racial scapegoating became the glue. Do you see what I'm saying? And the economic decline, I mean, feeling like they were being listened to, right? Which was the kind of thing. I don't know if that answers your question fully, but.
Well, we can talk about it later.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? Because there's a lot of people who are not convinced that it was because of, like, there's these graphs that show that the same population that voted for Obama in 2012 and 2008 voted for Trump, and that there is overlap in this electorate, right? And so they would say, you know, why I voted for Obama because I thought he was going to do something for me economically, and now I voted for Trump because now I think he's going to do. But again, and that is true. Like, that overlap does exist to some degree. But again, when you actually look at sort of like, well, did they do anything for me? He must have not done it, and why didn't he do it? It's very difficult to extricate race entirely from it and say it's only economics.
Yes. And the structure itself, I mean, people voted for Trump because the other choice was Clinton, right?
Right.
So there's also kind of structural things in terms of...
And I haven't gone into the misogyny of that aspect either, that what it would mean to vote for a woman for people who are deeply identified with, you have to have a male leader in order to, you know, so we haven't even touched that aspect. So it's very complicated. I'm giving you a slice. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk more about like the subprime mortgage crisis being like the biggest theft of wealth from like people of color, like in all history, and like why there was like the lack of accountability, I guess, like on the side of the banks. Like it seems like it should have been a lot more of a turning point.
Yeah. Not one person was put in jail.
Right. Nobody. Like
not
I
one.
don't understand that.
There was one guy.
And there might have been one fallout back.
He's a person of color, actually.
Is he? Oh my life.
Worked in one of the banks.
To be honest, there was no accountability because the government was complicit. The governmental oversight that was supposed to make sure that the ratings of, you know, the bundles that they created, right, that the ratings of mortgages were correct, was a government entity.
Right.
And they got paid not to do their job. And so they were totally complicit. It was so much knowledge that this was happening and lack of accountability overall that you would have had to put thousands of people in jail from government and private sector. And so I think in order to conceal just how insane it was, how deep the corruption was, they did nothing. But also because the U.S. economy now so overwhelmingly economically depends on, right, sort of those, those kind of mortgage companies staying afloat. I mean, if you think about what it would mean to sink Bank of America or Wells Fargo, to actually let them sink because their net worth actually declined to the way that it did because people didn't pay their mortgages. I mean, basically they knew that, again, the too big to fail type of thing. And so, and if you actually, you would have had to just put too many people in jail. So that's my answer for that, but it's speculation. I have no real evidence for that.
It seems like you've said a few times that like the messaging on the left has failed. Kind of.
Yeah.
What would you say would be an effective like counter messaging to the emotional politics of the right, and who do you think needs that the most? What groups of people should be directed at?
Good question. I think the left doesn't understand emotion. They keep trying to think that voting is rational. And so they keep giving you like economic policies and facts, and they're constantly in a defensive stance with respect to the conservative movement of saying, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true, which totally doesn't work to convince people otherwise, right? So I guess what I'm suggesting is that they need to propose an alternative vision. If not this, then what? What are you going to do for working people? What are you going to do for poor people? What are you going to do for people of color? What are you going to do for women? What are you going to do for students? And Bernie Sanders came close to proposing an alternative vision, but he tried to be, again, kind of take the race out of the economics. And then it became fractured very quickly because, of course, a huge number of poor people are communities of color or people who are dealing with the greatest level of oppression. And they're becoming a greater percentage of the electorate. So when you don't speak specifically to, or even recognize them as legible in your election kind of politics, right, then they're gonna be mad at you and stage a Black Lives Matter protest and hold you accountable, right? But he did come close to taking that resentment, anger, and fed upness with both what the Democratic Party had done so far and what the Republicans were doing, right? To try to create universal health care. I mean, things that people actually really want. A good number of Americans actually want these things, right? But you have to not just say it in like a blah kind of way. You have to give people a way to opt in, a way to desire to be part of something. And I don't think that the left, so that I would target it towards students, towards young people, specifically towards youth of color, right? Because they essentially for Obama proved to be the largest force of the kind of X factor that pushed him over into the winning the election in 2008. And then it was like as if they were forgotten, even though they were like so significant in galvanizing that, right? Talking about immigration in some real concrete ways for the Latino voting bloc right now is huge. But who has proposed like an actual alternative vision for immigration right now? I mean, we're just like still talking about like the dreamers. Nobody has done like a serious proposal for immigration reform, right? And in part because the country is so schizophrenic right now in what it wants, right? But I do think that if you created a way for people to find some common ground and spoke to different factions within that electorate and showed them why they have mutual interests together and are stronger together on an emotional basis, not just on a pragmatic like. The left for me is way overemphasizing pragmatism, which never works in politics. So that's what I would do. I really want sometimes to become a political analyst, but I don't think anybody would let me. Yeah.
So I don't have any background going into this. I just walked in.
Sure.
So do you think that maybe I think I see a lot of writing off of people that would kind of align themselves with the right more in the left. Do you think that maybe if the left were to not kind of write off this group of people that are oh, I think that I agree with what Trump has to say or whatever, maybe do you think if maybe we ask why or what do you think
are they convincible is what you're asking?
Yeah, or maybe just listening to them because I feel oftentimes what like what people say like they agree with, like that it has like roots in something, like
Yeah.
they're like you were saying, like, oh, like it's this thing of whiteness, it's tied to like being like on top and like you don't have something, you're
Right.
like, oh, okay, I gotta like blame this person, but like what if like we like kind of talk to them and said like, okay, like what do you need, what do you like what could we do to help you if we were in like power, like instead of just like saying like forget those guys, because
Right, right.
with these people like kind of
Yeah, you know, it's such a great question, and I used to sort of be much more dismissive on that account. And I was at this wedding one time, and this guy who had been a labor organizer, a black man who had been a labor organizer in white Appalachia, basically took me to task and said, you're dismissing people that if they were given a different pathway would actually align with labor movements on the left, but because nobody goes there to think that that is a site for organizing, they basically end up aligning with the conservative movement. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So he really took me to task on that dismissiveness. And so since then, I'm kind of two minds, right? I'm of the mind that we should always try, right? In the sense that, and I see, for example, the Poor People's Campaign doing this to a large degree. They're literally going to very poor white working communities and asking, both on a moral level, they're tapping into sort of like their Christian roots, right? And all of this, but also really asking them like economically, what are you suffering from? How do we come together to address this, right? And they're understanding specifically like the significance of the South and the rural poor in the South being like a political force that then, if you look at North Carolina and the amazing work that Reverend Barber did there, it's because he forged this alliance between people of color and poor whites that the government totally shifted in North Carolina. I mean, like, it's wild. Like, you gotta just kind of pay attention, right? So that's one answer. But there's also, as I've learned through many, many years of organizing and teaching, that there are some people who are so unreceptive to anything, even being asked a question, shut down, right? I call that the kind of lack of affective receptivity. Like, they don't have the emotional ability to hear what you're even saying or asking. They're so committed to an identity that is what they want to be that basically you're kind of wasting your breath. You see what I'm saying? And those people I'm not sure what to do with, because if there's any kind of opening, any kind of willfulness to communicate, to listen, to exchange, I would say yes. But if somebody indicates to me, I'm already prepackaged, I've already made up my mind, anything you're gonna say to me, I'm gonna go to town and fight with you, then to me, like, we're wasting a lot of organizing energy trying to convince people that have no interest in being convinced that some other possibility exists. You see what I'm saying? So it's a question that I think you'd have to answer on the ground. You know what I mean? So like, you have to try it, but you also have to kind of develop the discernment to tell who's who. And so for me, the key component is, are you receptive? Are you willing to communicate? Are you so firmly rooted in that ideological social conservative agenda? Like, for some people, right, even if you tell them, like, look, it would be actually economically benefit for you to vote for the Democratic Party. They serve the poor and your interests much more. But you tell this person who's really a diehard, sort of anti-abortion person, and that is the thing for them. And they will not, it doesn't matter what you tell them about their economic interests, how it will serve them. For them, the Democrats and the liberals are, against abortion, or pro-abortion, and as a result, I'm not gonna talk to you. You see what I'm saying? So it's like, it just depends on how people, what people latch their identities to and what's important to the belief structure that's so important to them that they're willing to die or like not let it go. You know what I mean? And I have that too. Like, there's certain beliefs that I'm not willing to relinquish. Now, I like to think I'm open to evidence, and if somebody came up with some different evidence than what I thought was the reality, I hope I'd be receptive, right? But do you see what I'm saying? The kind of, yeah. So it's really an on the ground question, but it's a great question because oftentimes white folks start acting like, oh, I'm such an evolved anti-racist, you're the one who just doesn't know crap, let me tell you. And then it becomes into this like game of like, I'm the most anti-racist of us all. And then it's just like shaming people who are actually there to learn, or who want to learn something, or are just starting and are interested. But if you're like beating them over the head all the time, then they're not likely to stay there and be shamed all the time. You know what I mean? So it's also about like, how do we engage people to actually believe that they're there for a genuine reason to learn, and also kind of address this like long learning curve that exists, And I think that's what work that white folks to do with other white folks, because that gets really old for people of color to have to do that work of like waiting for white folks to kind of get in tune with what's going on fully.
What do you think translates mass movements into political action? Because it seems like we've had a lot of political action recently in terms of like the marches against Trump, and very little political action, I guess.
Can you give me an example?
So just like the Wall Street protests, a lot of like Black Lives Matter protests, there have been like a number of movements in the last few years that and maybe I'm just like being cynical, or I don't know enough about it, but it seems like there have been marginal at best political actions taken. So how do you get from movement to
I hear
political action?
Black Lives Matter has actually done much more at a localized level than you might imagine. And so part of the thing is that I think we expect like national legislation as opposed to like localized legislation. But if you look and follow what happened at Ferguson as a result of Black Lives Matter organizing, it's incredible. I mean, they turned that entire police institutional structure on its head. The Ferguson Commission and the kind of accountability measures that they put in place, I mean, like, it's significant to what was there before, which was like an unbelievable level of systemic racism, right? And similarly at localized levels, the level of kind of police accountability, at the very least the police is on its toes being watched and knows like, that they can't just, I mean, they're still doing stuff with impunity, but like, it's a different moment than before Black Lives Matter was there to literally hold them, at the very least, do the ethical witnessing, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that the national structure is now so dominated by Trump administration kind of figureheads that a lot of people are, at least for now, either channeling their efforts towards elections, right? Like state level elections or congressional elections. And so like there's a lot of that voter mobilization type of stuff. But a lot of stuff, progressive stuff, is actually weirdly happening at governor level kind of legislation. So again, if you take North Carolina as a case study, and it's incredible what they've been able to achieve with a Republican legislation, right? But a Democratic governor. And so like there's these weird, like we're in a fight, we're in a serious fight about the direction of this country at every single stage of the movement, and you're right that I don't think that these movements have coalesced into some kind of enough of a movement to enact some kind of federal or national level policy. But again, it's sort of like if you study social movements, they take a while. I mean, the Montgomery bus boycott was in 1955. When King sort of just is working to desegregate public transportation. It's not till 1964, that the Civil Rights Act passes. And again, that was a different era of kind of like mass and anti-Vietnam War and so on and so forth. So you got to realize we're coming off of a very long era of a level of police and state repression. Like there was a counter-revolution to that that we're still barely coming out of. And the media infrastructure is way more controlled than it was in the 60s. In terms of who owns the airwaves, and it's all like 5 corporations. So they, there's that. And then there's
there's the militarized policing. I mean, that's just like no joke. You know what I mean? So like any like mass mobilization is constantly facing that. And it's almost like they don't even have time to emerge any kind of leadership because they're rounding people up before they even barely emerge. So, you know, you can't underestimate state repression here either. But yeah, I mean, it's to be determined. I don't know. Did you have one more?
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, going off of that, like the change at like a local level, do you think like most of like positive change, like, because it seems to me like we have a real problem with organizing on like a bigger level, so do you think like our energy is better spent like focusing on like maybe like local government, like you were saying, like with
I think almost all organizing starts out local.
Right.
I mean, it has to. That's just by virtue of geography. Here, you guys in Chicago, I mean, like, I'm about to bring Mariam Kaba out to Ithaca. She lived in Chicago for 20 years and organized against youth incarceration here. But like, she was part of this coalition that held the Chicago Police Department. They won the first reparations lawsuit against the police department for the tortures that the police chief had run against black men for 2 decades. I mean, you guys understand how huge that is? That's huge, you know? And so the Chicago Freedom School, the Chicago, you know, the Project NIA, the Survived and Punished, the Marissa Alexander, that was all Mariam Kaba. I mean, like, one black woman organizer and her leadership, right? If you just go to her website, mariamkaba.com, just look at what she did in Chicago. And again, you won't know that if you're not in the sort of localized activist scenes, right? But stuff is happening, and then you and I get to kind of benefit from it without even knowing that we're benefiting from it, right? Like, but like that reparations lawsuit, like, it set precedent, right? So what it means is that it's a thing for Chicago, but because it's a legal precedent, other people that could demonstrably show that police forces tortured or, you know, engaged in systemic police brutality over a long period of time could also win reparations lawsuits. Now, I'm not saying that's the only way to go, but it's a really significant precedent that then could kind of multiply. If you look at Standing Rock, right, everybody would be like, oh, they lost. Energy Partners now is building the pipeline, and the Sioux tribe has kind of gone back to what they were doing. But Standing Rock's, you know, basically sparked tons of movements for water protection across the globe. You know, I mean, like my upstate New York location, there's a Cayuga Lake. It's an indigenous location for the Cayuga peoples, and they're doing a water protectors around Cayuga Lake, which is being environmentally polluted by, you know, all of these kind. You know, so from, you know, it's like one thing shuts down, but 10 more things emerge from there. Ethnic studies in Tucson, Arizona, one of the most conservative states in the world, you know, the School Board of Education abolishes ethnic studies, Latinos, you know, Mexican American La Raza Studies program in the Tucson Unified School District, and they win. I mean, like, they pass like freaking, you know, state legislation banning, you know, they go in there and take all the Mexican author books out of the schools. Like, it's mind-boggling. That was like 2015, but it sparked this massive movement in California public schools to integrate ethnic studies. So it's like what looks like a loss ends up being a proliferation of other movements, right? Because the organizers in that area sort of teach the other people who are interested in that issue something elsewhere, you know? And eventually, if you're kind of like, if your nose is with movements, you see so many that you're like, it's amazing what people are doing, and you get all optimistic. You know, if you only study this chart, you're like, damn, things are looking bad, right? So it just kind of depends on what you're looking at. Yeah.
The Black Youth Project 100, the BYP 100.
Yeah, another Chicago group.
They just released a report about the Chicago gang database, which is a fairly recent phenomenon. The police setting up this gang database and putting people in this database that says, like, this is a person who has a gang affiliation, and it's very opaque how they put people in this database. They don't really understand. No one understands what the logic is. Like, what's the rationale? Is it just because you know someone? Is it because the police saw you standing on a corner with someone? Is it just because you're black? You know, there's no real logic to it, and there's all kinds of algorithms that they're supposedly using But it's all very opaque and behind the scenes, and BYP 100 kind of released this report that kind of cast a light on it, and now the Inspector General is sort of forcing the hand of the police to kind of say what's going on with this thing. And that, so you have something that, if you look at the difference between like the torture, this police torture thing, this is stuff that went on in the 80s and 90s.
For decades, yeah.
And it's only in the 2000s that you finally get people kind of admitting that it occurred. And then you have this Chicago gang database, which is also has kinds of problems. One of the things that they've kind of pointed to is that this has an economic impact because it means that people who are up for bail, even if you're in jail for like a parking violation, if you end up in this gang database, then you can be refused the ability to get bail. So it has really direct economic impacts, and we don't really understand how it works, but this movement kind of, they put together this report, they release it, and now the Inspector General is saying, what's up with this database, and it could end up with action.
BYP 100 has been like, they've been in existence like 5 years at most, and it's all black youth that is essentially leading the way. So it's like incredible, right, what even just like a small group of people can do. But again, they have to find a way of feeling empowered to do that, and that's the trick around resources and who has like you guys as students can leverage so many of your resources towards that, right? Because you have a lot of knowledge and capital on how to, like stuff that organizers need all the time, like do research on this, find out how many of this, like that sort of thing. There's always this kind of community research partnership that's very useful, or like social media skills or graphic design skills or setting up a poster or offering space. Like all of those things, right, end up being such crucial ways of leveraging what you've got to kind of like get something done. So I do think it's always local at some level, and then it sparks like a more national imagination, right, from there. So,
Well,
all right, I think I've talked your head off. So
thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you all so much.